There are stories that linger in the mind long after the details fade. Stories that ask us to consider the fragility of safety, the complexity of mental health, and the ways systems can fail the most vulnerable among us. The story of Mitris Richardson is one of these stories, not because it's filled with dramatic twists or shocking revelations, but because it's a quiet tragedy that unfolded slowly, inevitably, like watching storm clouds gather on a distant horizon. On a September evening in 2009, a young woman walked into an upscale restaurant in Malibu, California. By midnight, she would be released from police custody into the darkness of Malibu Canyon with no phone, no money, no car, and no way to reach safety. 11 months later, her remains would be discovered in a remote ravine, and the mystery of what happened during those missing hours would remain unsolved to this day. As you settle in, you can share where you're listening from and your current time. It's always comforting to see how many of us are awake together. And if these gentle true crime stories help you relax, you're welcome to subscribe for more nightly calm. This is the story of Mitris Lavon Richardson, a brilliant psychology graduate, a dancer, a daughter, a woman in crisis. It's a story about how quickly things can unravel, about the importance of compassion in moments of confusion, and about a family's endless search for answers that may never come. So settle in comfortably. Let your mind wander through this gentle telling of a case that continues to haunt those who knew Mitris and those who have come to know her story. This is a restful narrative, told with care and respect, about one September night when everything changed. Mitris Lavon Richardson was born on April 30th, 1985, in Southern California. She grew up in Covina, a suburban community in the San Gabriel Valley, east of Los Angeles. Raised by her mother, Latice Sutton, and her stepfather, Larry Sutton, Mitris was described by those who loved her as a ball of energy, vivacious, loving, full of life. Her Aunt Lauren would later recall how Mitris would walk into a room and make sure everyone took notice. Not through arrogance, but through the sheer force of her personality and warmth. Mitris attended South Hills High School in West Covina, where she was known as a bright, engaged student. After graduating, she set her sights on higher education, enrolling at California State University, Fullerton. In 2008, just 4 months before the events that would change everything, Mitris graduated with honors, earning her Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology. She was 23 years old, her whole future stretching out before her like an open road. Psychology wasn't just an academic interest for Mitris, it was a calling. She wanted to become a child psychologist, specifically focusing on working with children in the foster care system. She had worked as an intern for a forensic psychologist. Gaining practical experience in the field, she hoped to make her life's work. She was planning to apply to graduate school, taking the next steps toward turning her dreams into reality. To support herself while preparing for graduate school, Mitris held several jobs. She did clerical work at a shipping company. She performed as a go-go dancer at a popular club. She had even competed in beauty pageants, her natural grace and confidence serving her well in these competitions. Mitris was an open lesbian and had been in a committed relationship with her girlfriend, Tessa Moon, for about 2 years. She was living with her great-grandmother in South Los Angeles, saving money for her future education. By all accounts, Mitris was thriving. She was educated, employed, loved by her family and friends, pursuing her dreams. But beneath this bright surface, something was beginning to shift. In the weeks and months before September 2009, people close to Mitris began noticing changes. Her social media posts seemed strange at times. There were odd comments, references that didn't quite make sense. Friends and family would later tell investigators that Mitris had been awake for days at a time, possibly as many as 5 consecutive nights without sleep. Looking back through her diaries and text messages, investigators would find evidence that Mitris had been experiencing what appeared to be a bipolar episode. Bipolar disorder is a complex mental health condition characterized by extreme mood swings, including emotional highs, mania or hypomania, and lows, depression. During manic episodes, individuals may experience decreased need for sleep, racing thoughts, unusual talkativeness, and sometimes erratic or impulsive behavior. Whether Mitris had been formally diagnosed with bipolar disorder before September 2009 remains unclear. Her mother, Latice Sutton, would later acknowledge that her daughter had mental health challenges, possibly including bipolar disorder. What is clear is that in mid-September 2009, Mitris was not herself. Something was happening to her, chemically, neurologically, psychologically. The bright, focused young woman who had graduated with honors just months earlier was beginning to experience a crisis that she may not have fully understood herself. On the afternoon of September 16, 2009, Mitris left her great-grandmother's home in South Los Angeles and got into her Honda Civic. She began driving. Where she intended to go, we may never know. Perhaps she didn't know herself. When you're in the grip of a manic episode, thoughts can race faster than you can process them. Destinations can change on a whim. The world can seem filled with connections and meanings that aren't visible to others. Mitris drove north and west, eventually making her way out of the city proper and toward the coast. She followed the Pacific Coast Highway north through Santa Monica, through Topanga, past Pepperdine University. The ocean stretched out to her left, endless and blue. To her right, the Santa Monica Mountains rose up, covered in chaparral and dotted with expensive homes tucked into the hillsides. Around evening time, Mitris pulled off the Pacific Coast Highway at a restaurant called Jeffrey's, located in Malibu. Jeffrey's is the kind of place you go for special occasions. A high-end steakhouse known for its stunning ocean views, its celebrity sightings, and its twinkling lights that make the outdoor patio feel magical as the sun sets over the Pacific. The restaurant sits on a bluff overlooking the ocean, with panoramic views that draw visitors from around the world. Mitris pulled into the parking lot. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that no one could stop. The valet working at Jeffrey's that evening would later describe Mitris' car as looking ransacked and characterized by disheveled chaos. This wasn't the neat Honda Civic of someone just out for an evening drive. Something was clearly amiss. But that wasn't the strangest part of Mitris' arrival at Jeffrey's. After pulling in, Mitris climbed into the valet's car, his personal vehicle, not a customer's car he was parking. The valet watched in surprise as this young woman began rifling through his CD collection. He asked if she was okay. Her response was cryptic. "It's subliminal," she told him. Then she added something that would be repeated in police reports and news stories for years to come. "I'm here to avenge Michael Jackson's death." Michael Jackson had died just 3 months earlier, on June 25, 2009. His death had dominated headlines worldwide. For someone experiencing a manic episode, the death of such a cultural icon might take on outsized significance, might seem to carry hidden meanings and messages. To Mitris, in that moment, there was apparently some connection between herself, this restaurant, and the king of pop's death. The valet relayed this interaction to Caroline Paris Martin, who was working as the hostess at Jeffrey's that night. Despite Mitris' unusual behavior, Caroline seated her alone at a table. The restaurant was busy that evening. It was a Wednesday night, September 16th, and the weather was beautiful. The patio was full of diners enjoying their meals, the murmur of conversation mixing with the distant sound of waves below. What happened over the next hour or so would be pieced together later from the accounts of restaurant staff and other patrons. Mitris ordered food. The total bill would eventually come to $89. But as she sat at her table, her behavior became increasingly bizarre. She spoke to other diners, saying things that didn't make sense. She talked about the language of numbers and asked if people understood what she meant. She made references to subliminal messages. She seemed agitated, confused, disconnected from the reality around her. The staff at Jeffrey's grew concerned. This wasn't the behavior of someone who was drunk or high on drugs. It was something else. Mitris seemed to be experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. She wasn't violent or threatening, just strange, disoriented, troubling to watch. When it came time to settle her bill, Mitris was unable to pay. She didn't have her wallet with her, or if she did, she wasn't able to access it or understand that she needed to pay. The restaurant staff tried to help her. They could see she was in distress. They attempted multiple times to work with her to settle the bill, not because they were primarily concerned about the money, but because they were worried about her well-being. What should they do with this young woman who clearly wasn't okay? She wasn't intoxicated. She had passed a field sobriety test that staff administered informally. She wasn't on drugs as far as they could tell, but she wasn't lucid either. She was somewhere else mentally and emotionally. Finally, around 8:30 p.m., the staff at Jeffries made a decision. They called the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department's Malibu/Lost Hills station for assistance. In their call, they were clear. They weren't just calling about someone skipping out on a restaurant bill. They were calling because they were concerned about this woman's safety. They needed help with someone who appeared to be in the middle of a mental health crisis. Deputies arrived at Jeffries around 8:30 p.m. They spoke with the staff and then they spoke with Mitris. According to the police report that would later be written, Mitris appeared cooperative and polite. She seemed lucid to the deputies. She passed a field sobriety test. She was not drunk. The deputy who conducted the test stated that she did not appear to be under the influence of alcohol or drugs. The deputies searched Mitris' Honda Civic. Inside, they found a small amount of marijuana, a misdemeanor amount. They also found empty prescription bottles and several gallon-sized bottles of liquor and beer. The car's interior was indeed disheveled, consistent with what the valet had described. But they found Mitris' purse, her cell phone, her money, all the things she would need to get home safely. The decision was made to arrest Mitris on a misdemeanor charge of defrauding an innkeeper, essentially, not paying her restaurant bill. Her car would be impounded and towed to a tow yard on the Pacific Coast Highway. Her belongings, her purse, her phone, her money, were locked inside the car. Mitris was handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol car. The deputies drove her approximately 20 miles inland, up into Malibu Canyon, to the Malibu/Lost Hills Sheriff's Station in Calabasas. At approximately 10 p.m., Mitris Richardson was booked into the jail at the Lost Hills Station. She was photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell. The charge against her was a misdemeanor, not paying an $89 restaurant bill. The small amount of marijuana found in her car was noted but not a major concern. She had no prior criminal record. Under normal circumstances, this would be the kind of thing you'd be cited for and released, maybe with a court date to appear later. But these were not normal circumstances, because what the restaurant staff had seen, what had prompted their call, was not criminal behavior. It was mental health crisis. News of Mitris' arrest reached her family quickly. Her mother, Latice Sutton, received the call and immediately became alarmed. Latice knew her daughter. She knew Mitris had been acting strangely recently. She knew something wasn't right. When she learned that Mitris had been arrested for bizarre behavior at a restaurant, her concern intensified dramatically. Latice called the Malibu/Lost Hills Sheriff's Station. The exact time of this call isn't documented in available records, but what is documented is the substance of the conversation. Latice told the deputies at the station about her concerns regarding Mitris' mental health. She explained that her daughter had been acting erratically. She asked, pleaded really, for them to keep Mitris at the station until morning, until Latice could make the drive out to Calabasas to pick her daughter up and take her home safely. According to Latice and other family members, the station personnel assured her that Mitris would not be released until morning. They told her they would keep her daughter there overnight, safe in the jail cell, until Latice could arrive. Latice went to bed that night believing her daughter was secure, that she would be able to collect her in the morning and get her the help she clearly needed. But something happened between that promise and dawn. Something shifted in the assessment at the Lost Hills station. The deputies working the overnight shift looked at Mitris Richardson and saw something different from what the restaurant staff had seen, different from what her mother feared. At 12:28 a.m. on September 17, 2009, just over 2 hours after the phone call from Latice, Mitris Richardson was released from custody at the Malibu/Lost Hills Sheriff's Station. She walked out into the night wearing the same clothes she'd been arrested in. She had no purse. It was locked in her impounded car. She had no cell phone, also in the car. She had no money. She had no car. She had no jacket to ward off the coastal chill. She had no way to call for help. The official statement from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, delivered by spokesman Steve Whitmore, would later explain the decision. She exhibited no signs of mental illness or intoxication. She was fine. She's an adult. According to the Sheriff's Department's account, Mitris had been offered the choice to remain voluntarily at the station jail until daylight hours, or until her mother could arrange transportation. They said she chose to leave. Did she? Did Mitris Richardson, in the middle of what her diaries and later analysis would suggest was a bipolar episode, after days without sleep, after behaving so bizarrely at a restaurant that staff felt compelled to call for help? Did she truly have the capacity to make an informed decision about her own safety at 12:28 a.m.? There's a detail about that night that became significant later. According to jailer Sharon Cummings' testimony on the record, she escorted Mitris to the front of the station to use the payphone before she left. This would suggest that Mitris wanted to call someone, that she recognized she needed help getting home. But here's the problem. When Mitris' family arrived at the station for a press conference just days later, a technician from the phone company was there installing a payphone in the lobby. Why? Because there was no working payphone at the time Mitris was released. So either the jailer's memory was faulty, or she was being dishonest. Either way, the implication is troubling. Mitris may have wanted to call for help, may have been told she could use a phone, and then discovered there was no phone available, or she was never given that option at all. What we know for certain is this. At approximately 12:30 a.m., Mitris Richardson walked out of the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station. She turned left or right onto Agora Road, a dark, winding canyon road with no sidewalks, no streetlights, surrounded by steep hillsides covered in brush. She began walking, and she vanished into the night. For the next several hours, Mitris Richardson's whereabouts were unknown. But we have one more documented sighting, one more moment when she appeared briefly before disappearing for good. At approximately 6:30 a.m. on September 17th, roughly 6 hours after her release from the sheriff's station, a man named Bill Smith looked out the window of his home in Monte Nido. Monte Nido is a small, affluent community in the Santa Monica Mountains, about 5.5 miles from the Lost Hills station where Mitris had been released. It's a beautiful area, but remote and hilly, with winding roads and homes tucked away from main streets. Bill Smith was a former news anchor for KTLA, a major Los Angeles television station. He and his wife Karen lived on a quiet property surrounded by natural landscape. That morning, looking into his backyard, Smith saw something unusual. A young African-American woman was lying on their lawn. She appeared to be resting or perhaps sleeping. Smith opened his window and called out to her. "Are you okay?" he asked. The woman looked up at him and responded calmly, "I'm just resting." Her tone was not frantic or frightened. She didn't ask for help. She simply said she was resting, as if it were the most normal thing in the world to be lying on a stranger's lawn at dawn in the Santa Monica Mountains. Bill Smith was understandably concerned. This wasn't normal behavior, even for the relaxed culture of Southern California. He closed his window and immediately called the police to report the situation. By the time deputies arrived at the Smith residence, the woman was gone. She had left on her own, walking away from the property and disappearing once again into the landscape. For many years, it was believed that this woman was Mitris Richardson. The timeline matched. 6 hours after her release, 5.5 miles from the sheriff's station, an African-American woman with an afro hairstyle, behaving oddly. It seemed to fit, but we cannot be absolutely certain it was her. No one took a photograph. No one asked her name. By the time police arrived, she was gone. If it was Mitris, this sighting tells us several things. First, it tells us she was alive at dawn on September 17th, nearly 6 hours after her release. Second, it tells us she had managed to travel approximately 5.5 miles from the Lost Hills station to Monte Nido. How did she cover that distance? Did she walk the entire way along dark canyon roads? Did someone give her a ride? If someone did pick her up, who were they, and where did they take her afterward? The terrain between the Lost Hill Station and Monte Nido is not easy to navigate on foot, especially at night. Agora Road and the connecting canyon roads are winding, hilly, without sidewalks or adequate lighting. It would have been a difficult and potentially dangerous walk for someone unfamiliar with the area, particularly someone in the middle of a mental health crisis. But somehow, Mitris ended up at the Smith residence. And then she left. And after that moment, after Bill Smith saw her resting on his lawn at 6:30 a.m. on September 17, 2009, Mitris Richardson was never seen alive again. Her family reported her missing on September 18th. The search began almost immediately. Mitris' face appeared on missing person flyers throughout Southern California. Her story was featured on local news broadcasts. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department organized searches of the Malibu Canyon area. Volunteers joined the efforts, combing through brush and hiking trails, calling Mitris' name, hoping for some sign of her. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Fall gave way to winter. The searches continued sporadically, but hope began to fade. Where could she have gone? How could a young woman simply vanish in an area as populated as Los Angeles County? August 9, 2010, nearly 11 months after Mitris disappeared, brought a breakthrough, though not the one her family had prayed for. California State Park Rangers were conducting a sweep of Dark Canyon, a remote area in the Malibu Hills. They were searching for signs of an illegal marijuana farm that had been operated by a drug cartel. 1 year earlier, the farm had been raided. More than 1,000 plants had been uprooted and destroyed. Now the Rangers wanted to know if the operation had resumed. As they hiked through the rugged terrain, pushing through brush and navigating the steep ravine, one of the Rangers made a discovery that stopped him in his tracks. Partially hidden beneath mulch, twigs, and leaves, he saw a human skull. Dark curls of hair still clung to it. Nearby, scattered in the brush, were other bones, a partial skeleton, mostly obscured by natural debris. The Rangers immediately contacted the Malibu/Lost Hills Sheriff Station. What followed was a series of decisions and actions that would later be heavily criticized as mishandling of a potential crime scene. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department's Air 5 helicopter was dispatched to the location. It airlifted LASD homicide detectives and members of the search and rescue team into the ravine. According to protocol, the helicopter was supposed to then airlift the coroner's team to process the scene. But Air 5 was diverted twice to rescue stranded hikers miles away. While waiting for the coroner to arrive, the homicide detectives on scene made a controversial decision. They began moving the remains. They relocated bones without proper documentation, without waiting for the coroner's team, without following standard procedures for a potential crime scene. Ed Winter, the assistant chief coroner for Los Angeles County, would later state bluntly, "The sheriff's department moved her remains without our permission. I don't think we'll ever know what happened to her unless someone comes forward with additional information." The scene had been compromised before it could be properly processed. When the coroner's team finally tried to return to complete their work the next day, they encountered another problem. They couldn't find the site. The team had not brought anyone who had been at the location the day before. Neither the homicide detectives nor any search and rescue team members who knew exactly where the remains had been found. Initially, the coroner's team claimed they had been dropped in the wrong canyon by the helicopter. A later investigation revealed the real problem. They had forgotten their GPS device with the site coordinates on board the helicopter. Dr. Rhonda Hampton, a clinical psychologist who was a family friend and had been deeply involved in the search for Mitris, expressed her frustration. "The coroner's behavior is also unbelievable to me. This is your job every day. How do you leave bones down there? How do you forget your GPS?" It would take 2 more weeks before the coroner's team successfully returned to the actual site. On August 25, 2010, they recovered 9 additional bones that had been left behind. The location where the remains were found was significant in several ways. Dark Canyon is extremely remote and difficult to access. It's about 6.5 miles from the Lost Hills Sheriff Station and approximately 1 mile from the Smith residence in Monte Nido, where the woman believed to be Mitris had been seen resting. The area is characterized by steep terrain, dense brush, and few trails. It's not somewhere you would wander by accident. The condition and location of the remains raised immediate questions. Mitra's body was found naked. Her skull and spinal cord were detached from the rest of her skeleton. She was partially mummified, the result of 11 months of exposure to the elements. Approximately 100 feet down the ravine from where most of her remains were found, investigators discovered her clothing. Her dark bra, a pair of blue jeans, and a pink belt. Her clothes had been scattered, separated from her body by a significant distance. Using dental records, the remains were positively identified as Mitras Levon Richardson. On August 12, 2010, her family received the news they had been dreading for nearly a year. Mitras was dead. But knowing she was dead didn't answer the questions that mattered most. How did she die? How did she end up in that remote canyon? Why was she naked? Why were her clothes so far from her body? What happened during those 11 months between her disappearance and the discovery of her remains? On August 11, 2010, a board-certified forensic pathologist from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office conducted an autopsy on Mitras Richardson's remains. The pathologist was thorough and professional, consulting with forensic anthropologist Clea Koff to ensure proper analysis of the skeletal remains. But the autopsy revealed something deeply frustrating. The pathologist could not determine how Mitras died. There was no evidence of bullet wounds, no evidence of knife wounds or stabbing, no evidence of blunt force trauma, no fractured bones that would indicate she had been beaten. The hyoid bone, located in the neck and potentially indicative of strangulation if fractured, was not among the recovered skeletal elements, so they couldn't determine if she had been strangled. The 11 months of exposure to the elements had taken their toll. The body was partially decomposed and partially mummified. Soft tissue that might have shown signs of trauma was largely gone. Without that soft tissue, many potential causes of death simply couldn't be determined from skeletal remains alone. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. Not homicide, not suicide, not accident, not natural causes. Simply undetermined. To this day, that remains the official classification. But undetermined didn't satisfy Mitra's family or the growing number of advocates and community members who were following the case. Dr. Rhonda Hampton expressed what many were thinking. The problem that I have with this case is investigators were too quick to conclude that it was not murder. They never put out there that there is a possibility of homicide. There is no way Mitras could have hiked that canyon. Mitra's father, daughter had been taken to that location against her will, that she had been tortured, and that when her captors were done, they killed her. In his view, the remote location, the condition of the body, the scattered clothing, all of it pointed to foul play. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department maintained that there was no evidence of homicide, no evidence of foul play. Their working theory was that Mitras, in the grip of her mental health crisis, had wandered into the canyon on her own and had somehow died there, perhaps from exposure, perhaps from dehydration, perhaps from a fall that caused internal injuries that weren't visible on skeletal remains months later. But this theory raised its own questions. How did someone in the middle of a mental health crisis, unfamiliar with the area, navigate into one of the most remote and difficult-to-reach parts of Malibu Canyon? If she died from exposure or dehydration, why was she naked? Why were her clothes removed and scattered? If she removed them herself, why would she do that? And if someone else removed them, doesn't that strongly suggest foul play? Adding to the family's anguish was another discovery. When Clea Koff, the forensic anthropologist working with the family, flew in to conduct her own independent examination of Mitras' remains, she made a shocking find inside Mitras' body bag. A bag of Mitras' clothing that had never been sent to the crime lab for testing. Critical evidence that might have answered questions about what happened to her had been sitting in her body bag, unexamined. Koff held a news conference in December 2010 outlining her findings and raising serious questions about how the case had been handled from start to finish. The mishandling of the crime scene, the delayed recovery of all the remains, the failure to properly test evidence. Each mistake made it less likely that the truth about Mitras' death would ever be known. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department faced intense criticism for how they handled both Mitra's arrest and release, and the subsequent investigation into her disappearance and death. The Office of Independent Review, OIR, which oversees the Sheriff's Department, conducted an investigation into the department's actions. In July 2010, the OIR released a report concluding that deputies had acted legally and responsibly in arresting and releasing Mitras Richardson. According to the report, station personnel offered Mitras the choice to remain voluntarily at the station jail until daylight hours or until her transportation arrived, and she chose to leave. The report stated, as a result of the monitoring process, OIR has concluded that the station personnel acted legally and reasonably in taking Ms. Richardson into custody and then releasing her from custody. But this conclusion satisfied almost no one outside the Sheriff's Department. Mitra's family, advocates, and many members of the public pointed out what seemed obvious. A young woman in the middle of a mental health crisis, who had been arrested specifically because restaurant staff called for help due to her bizarre behavior, who had been awake for multiple days, who was exhibiting clear signs of psychological distress. That woman should not have been released alone at 12:30 a.m. into a dark canyon road with no phone, no money, no car, and no way to get help. Latice Sutton told Essence magazine, "Our first responders need to be able to get us the assistance that we need, because law enforcement is not just there to enforce the law. They are also there to protect and serve us. And if they are being told by witnesses that someone is acting crazy, speaking in gibberish, and you are seeing this person acting in a peculiar manner, and you know that they are not intoxicated, then you have a duty to get them some help." The family filed 2 wrongful death lawsuits against the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, accusing the department of negligence. In August 2011, they reached a settlement. Los Angeles County agreed to pay $900,000 to resolve the lawsuits. Each parent, Michael Richardson and Latice Sutton, who were not married to each other, received $450,000. But money couldn't bring back answers. Money couldn't explain what happened to Mitras during those 11 months. And money couldn't ease the pain of losing a daughter whose death remained officially undetermined. The case attracted attention from multiple law enforcement oversight bodies. In November 2015, the California Attorney General's office under Kamala Harris reviewed 500 pages of documents related to the case and initially replied that it had not found grounds for criminal charges against the sheriff or deputies involved in Mitras' release. However, in January 2016, the Attorney General's office reversed itself and announced it was beginning a criminal investigation. That investigation would take another year. In January 2017, the California Attorney General's office concluded its criminal investigation and announced it would not bring charges against anyone involved in Mitras Richardson's release from custody. The decision not to prosecute effectively closed the door on any criminal accountability for the decisions made that night. Over the years, various individuals came under scrutiny as potential suspects in Mitras' death. One man in particular, a resident of the area with a criminal record who had allegedly made statements to acquaintances about encountering a woman matching Mitras' description, became a focus of intense speculation. Investigators searched his property and found items including women's underwear, but no forensic link to Mitras was ever established. The creek bed where Mitras' remains were found is adjacent to a 21-acre ranch that was known for producing adult films. The area is very secluded and has direct access to the creek bed. Some residents reportedly heard screams in that area on several nights after Mitras disappeared, but these reports were never confirmed and couldn't be definitively linked to her. Each potential lead was investigated. Each led to a dead end. The case remained and remains unsolved. Today, more than 15 years after Mitras Richardson disappeared, her death remains officially classified as undetermined. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department says the case is still open, but without new leads, there is nowhere to go. No arrests have been made. No charges have been filed. No one has been held criminally responsible for what happened to Mitras, whether that was criminal negligence in her release or something more sinister in the days and months that followed. In December 2021, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors voted to reestablish a reward in Mitras' case. The county now offers $20,000 for information leading to an arrest and conviction, combined with standing rewards from the cities of Malibu and Calabasas. The total reward money available is $40,000. Supervisor Holly Mitchell, who sponsored the motion, said, "For me, I remember clearly the case of Mitris and really thought it was important to acknowledge the fact that she was failed perhaps by multiple systems. She was a woman who needed to be protected, and that didn't happen." Mitris' mother, Latice Sutton, continues to hope that someone will come forward with information. "I'm hopeful that someone knows something," she has said. "Someone saw something that night or in the days after. Someone knows what happened to my daughter." The case has been featured in multiple documentaries and true crime programs. ABC 7's Unsolved LA. The disappearance of Mitris Richardson examined the case in detail, obtaining previously unreleased footage and conducting new interviews. The investigation discovery series, Disappeared, featured Mitris' case in an episode titled Lost in the Dark. Podcasts including Hell and Gone and My Favorite Murder have covered her story, reaching new audiences and keeping attention on the case. But attention hasn't translated into answers. The fundamental questions remain. How did Mitris Richardson end up in Dark Canyon? Did she wander there on her own in the midst of her mental health crisis? Or did someone take her there? If she died of natural causes or exposure, why was she naked and why were her clothes scattered? If someone harmed her, who was it, and why has no evidence of that person ever emerged? Mitris LaVon Richardson was 24 years old when she died. She should have gone on to graduate school. She should have become the child psychologist she dreamed of being. She should have worked with foster children, using her education and her empathy to help kids who needed someone to understand them. She should have had decades of life ahead of her. Relationships, career achievements, travel, joy, growth, all the experiences that make up a full life. Instead, she has become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how mental health crises require compassion, not just procedure, a reminder of how quickly someone can slip through the cracks of systems that should protect them. A reminder that sometimes, when we fail to help someone in their moment of greatest need, the consequences can be irreversible and tragic. Somewhere, perhaps, someone knows what happened to Mitris Richardson after she was seen resting on that lawn at dawn on September 17, 2009. Someone might know where she went, who she encountered, how she ended up in that remote canyon. If that person exists, they have carried that secret for 15 years. And until they speak, Mitris' story will remain unfinished, a mystery that haunts everyone who has come to know her name. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps spare a thought for Mitris. Remember her not as a victim or a mystery, but as the vibrant young woman she was, full of energy, full of promise, full of dreams she never got to fulfill. Remember her laughter, her ambition, her desire to help children who needed someone in their corner. And remember that behind every unsolved case, there is a person who was loved, who mattered, who deserved better than what they received. The Santa Monica Mountains are quiet tonight, as they are every night. The canyons sleep peacefully beneath the stars. And somewhere in those hills, in a place that was once dark and frightening, but is now marked with memorial flowers and photographs, people remember Mitris Richardson. They remember, and they wait for answers that may never come. Rest peacefully, Mitris. Your story has been told with the respect and care it deserves. And one day, perhaps, the full truth of what happened will finally come to light. Tonight, we begin with a quiet and thoughtful exploration of a case that has lingered in the minds of many for more than a decade. It is the story of Lauren Elizabeth Spirer, a young college student whose disappearance remains one of the most well-known unsolved mysteries in the American Midwest. This is not a story told for fear or suspense. Instead, it is shared in a calm, reflective way, meant to guide listeners through the events gently, softly, and with full respect for Lauren and her family. Lauren was born on January 17, 1991, and grew up in the peaceful suburban community of Scarsdale, New York. People who knew her described her as energetic, warm, and full of a contagious friendliness that made it easy for her to make connections. She was close to her parents, Charlene and Robert, and maintained friendships from childhood, summer camps, and her early school years. She was the kind of person who left impressions, little memories that others carried with them, long after she was gone. When she enrolled at Indiana University Bloomington, Lauren entered a new chapter filled with excitement and possibility. She chose to study textiles merchandising, a field that blended her creativity with her interest in fashion. College life brought new routines, new friends, and a sense of independence that felt both empowering and natural for her age. She was active, social, and enjoyed the rhythm of campus life. The casual gatherings, study sessions, late-night conversations, and shared laughter. Bloomington itself is a college town with a gentle atmosphere, especially on warm evenings. Students walk along tree-lined streets, coffee shops buzz with light chatter, and the university buildings glow softly under the night lamps. It was in this environment, familiar, relaxed, and comforting, that Lauren lived out her daily routine. To many who later heard her story, it felt almost unimaginable that someone could vanish from such a setting without clear answers. Before her disappearance, there was nothing unusual in Lauren's life that signaled anything out of the ordinary. She was doing what so many young adults do, balancing academic life with friendships, navigating the experience of living away from home, and enjoying the social aspects of university life. What makes Lauren's story resonate with so many is how ordinary everything seemed before that night. There was no visible warning, no dramatic shift, no indication that anything was about to change. As we begin this 60-minute narrative, we'll walk slowly and carefully through what is known. Each detail will be presented gently, with a steady pace, allowing space for reflection. This approach is meant not only to inform, but also to ease the mind, perfect for listeners settling in with soft rain sounds, dim lights, or the quiet stillness of night. On the evening of June 2nd, 2011, Bloomington settled into the kind of early summer warmth that lingers comfortably past sunset. The sky drifted from gold to deep blue, and campus life moved at its usual relaxed rhythm. For many students, it was a night like any other. Light conversations, group gatherings, and small pockets of activity across the city. For Lauren Spirer, it was a chance to unwind with friends, something familiar and unremarkable in every way. Lauren began her evening at her apartment complex, a place where she felt at ease, surrounded by friends and neighbors she often spent time with. As nighttime approached, she chose to meet up with close friends who lived nearby. The environment was casual, friendly, and typical of a warm college night. People relaxed, talked, and enjoyed the slow-moving hours that stretched toward midnight. Throughout the evening, Lauren appeared to be in good spirits. She laughed, chatted, and enjoyed the company of the friends she trusted. Nothing in her behavior suggested worry or fear. Nothing seemed unusual or out of place. The gathering wasn't large or wild, just the kind of calm, easy social time that blends seamlessly into the rhythm of everyday student life. As the night moved forward, the small group of friends shifted locations, something that often happens among students who live close to one another. They moved from one apartment to another, each place offering a different space to sit, talk, and continue their evening together. The atmosphere remained relaxed, with people drifting in and out of conversations, catching up on recent events, and enjoying the feeling of being young, free, and surrounded by familiar faces. By the time the clock moved past midnight and into the early morning hours of June 3rd, Lauren was still spending time with friends. She walked between apartments, each building just a short distance apart. In these moments, she wasn't alone. There were always other people nearby, other students stepping outside, others passing through the quiet, dimly lit walkways. Nothing about the environment felt threatening or unusual. It was simply a mild, peaceful college night. The group eventually settled into a routine, talking, relaxing, and letting time pass naturally. It wasn't a rushed night or a chaotic one. It was the kind of evening where hours blend together softly, without anyone paying close attention to the exact time. The details of the night, when viewed later, became important in understanding the timeline. But in the moment, everything felt ordinary and familiar. As the night deepened and the city grew quieter, Lauren continued spending time in the company of friends. These late-night hours would become a central part of the mystery surrounding her disappearance. But when she lived them, they were simply moments shared among people she trusted, with no hint of uncertainty or danger. As the night stretched past midnight into the early morning hours of June 3, 2011, Lauren Spiros movements began to form the timeline that would later become the focus of investigation. Around this time, she was seen walking near the downtown area of Bloomington, a familiar setting for many students who often explored the quiet streets after evening gatherings. The town was calm, with soft streetlights casting long, gentle shadows across the sidewalks, creating a sense of stillness that contrasted with the lively energy of the earlier evening. Lauren had decided to leave the apartment gathering to continue walking with friends. These walks were not unusual. Students often moved between residences and social spots within short distances. She was accompanied by companions for part of the walk, chatting lightly and laughing quietly, enjoying the ordinary rhythm of late-night conversation. At this point, she appeared relaxed and in good spirits, moving through the familiar surroundings without any sign of concern or fear. The last confirmed sighting of Lauren was near a small intersection close to the downtown area, where she briefly separated from her friends. They paused, exchanged words, and watched as she walked on, intending to continue toward another destination. Observers described her as calm, composed, and confident, carrying herself with the ease of someone who knew her environment well. The streets were quiet, and the usual sounds of a college town. Distant voices, occasional traffic, the soft hum of lights, added to the gentle atmosphere of the night. From this point forward, the details become less certain. The moments between her last confirmed sighting and when she was reported missing are filled with gaps, creating a quiet tension not of danger, but of absence. Friends later recalled her plans for the night, which were simple and ordinary. A return to her apartment, rest before another day of classes, and the ongoing rhythm of young adult life. Nothing in her known plans suggested anything extraordinary or alarming. Law enforcement later reconstructed these final movements carefully, using witness statements, camera footage, and timelines provided by friends. Each piece of information was examined gently, like assembling a quiet puzzle, to create as accurate a picture as possible. Yet, even with detailed investigation, the final moments remain unclear, leaving a quiet space where answers should be. This uncertainty is part of what has made Lauren's disappearance resonate deeply with so many. An ordinary night interrupted, leaving only questions that remain unanswered. As we reflect on these last known sightings, it's important to remember Lauren as she was in these moments. A young woman walking through a familiar town, enjoying conversation, laughter, and the calm of a summer night. The streets were quiet, the atmosphere soft, and her steps were steady. It is in this quietness that we begin to appreciate the poignancy of her disappearance, not through fear or shock, but through calm observation of what was and what remains unknown. The early hours of June 3rd brought a quiet tension to Bloomington as Lauren Spiros' absence became noticeable. Friends and roommates began to realize that she had not returned home, a small, unsettling shift from the ordinary rhythm of a summer morning. What had seemed like a typical night was now marked by a sense of unease. Her apartment, usually filled with the light of early risers and the quiet hum of normal activity, was empty of her presence, leaving a gentle void that prompted concern. Lauren's parents were soon contacted, their morning unfolding slowly as they received news that their daughter had not been seen. The realization that something might be amiss moved deliberately, without dramatic urgency, but with a deep, quiet worry. This worry became the starting point for action. Friends retraced steps, checked common areas, and attempted gentle contact by phone and text. The warmth and humor that had characterized Lauren's life now met the soft weight of uncertainty. As the day progressed, local authorities were notified, and the initial response began in a calm, structured manner. Officers spoke with friends and acquaintances, gathering basic information about her last known whereabouts. This included the timeline from the previous night, details about her companions, and the streets she had walked. Everything was approached systematically, like assembling a quiet, complex puzzle. Each fact was recorded carefully, every recollection noted with a steady hand. Searches began slowly, focusing first on the most familiar locations. Friends, neighbors, and volunteers walked the nearby streets, checking alleys, parking lots, and other spaces Lauren might have passed. The town's quiet summer morning, with soft sunlight spilling across sidewalks and leafy trees, contrasted with the concern in the minds of those searching. People moved gently, calling her name softly, hoping to hear a familiar response that never came. The calmness of the environment made the absence even more poignant. In these early hours, law enforcement worked to consolidate information while maintaining an organized, methodical approach. Officers checked campus areas, reviewed any available surveillance footage, and spoke with anyone who might have seen Lauren during the late hours. The tone of the investigation was deliberate, thorough, and measured, prioritizing accuracy and clarity over haste. It was a soft, persistent effort, aimed at uncovering the truth without alarm. As the day wore on, awareness of Lauren's disappearance spread. Friends, classmates, and neighbors felt the quiet gravity of the situation. Social media and local communication channels began to carry gentle messages of concern, hoping to gather information or sightings. The atmosphere was one of reflection rather than panic, a community aware of the missing student, careful not to rush to conclusions, yet filled with hope that she would be found. As the days passed following Lauren Spirer's disappearance, the quiet concern of her friends and family transformed into a more structured search. The initial hours had been marked by gentle worry and careful retracing of her steps, but now the investigation began to expand, reaching deeper into Bloomington and beyond. Law enforcement, along with volunteers, approached each lead methodically, taking time to consider each detail without rushing, maintaining the calm tone that would become a hallmark of the careful investigation. Investigators began to organize search parties, covering streets, parks, and areas Lauren was known to frequent. Every alleyway, parking lot, and quiet street corner was checked with meticulous care. Volunteers moved slowly, scanning the ground, calling her name softly, listening for any hint or sound that might indicate where she had gone. The early summer air was warm but gentle, carrying the soft sounds of a town returning to normal daytime life, even as the search quietly intensified. During this period, tips and sightings began to arrive from the public. Some were small, seemingly insignificant observations, someone recalling seeing a young woman matching Lauren's description, or noticing a car parked in an unusual location. Each report was treated with attention and patience. Investigators followed up on every detail, no matter how minor it seemed, understanding that even the smallest clue could gently illuminate a piece of the puzzle. There was no rush. The process was careful, like a slow, deliberate unraveling of a quiet thread. Throughout the investigation, friends and family maintained a presence in the search, offering support, guidance, and insight into Lauren's routines and habits. Their calm, steady involvement allowed investigators to create a clearer picture of her movements and interactions in the hours leading up to her disappearance. This combination of community effort and professional method helped ensure that no stone was left unturned, approached with respect and measured persistence rather than frenzy. As weeks turned into months, law enforcement continued to follow leads methodically, revisiting areas, re-interviewing witnesses, and reviewing available evidence. They used every tool at their disposal, but always with a measured, deliberate pace. Each step of the investigation was designed to preserve the integrity of information while maintaining a quiet and respectful approach. There was a gentle focus on understanding what had happened rather than generating alarm, which helped keep the narrative thoughtful and calm. The search also extended beyond immediate surroundings, reaching out to nearby towns and regional networks. Alerts were shared quietly with neighboring jurisdictions, and authorities collaborated with state and federal agencies. The process was steady and systematic, a soft persistence that underscored the seriousness of the case while preserving a sense of calm professionalism. As the search for Lauren Spirer extended into weeks and months, investigators turned their attention to the careful process of gathering information through interviews and analysis. This stage of the investigation required patience, attention to detail, and a calm, measured approach. Each person connected to Lauren, friends, acquaintances, and those who had seen her that night, was approached gently, with questions asked in a way that encouraged clear recollections without causing stress or discomfort. Friends were asked to describe the events of that evening, from the first moments of the gathering to the last confirmed sightings. Investigators sought to reconstruct Lauren's movements as accurately as possible, gently piecing together conversations, walks, and ordinary actions. Every small detail mattered. The timing of steps along sidewalks, brief exchanges of words, the environment of the downtown streets, and even minor gestures that might reveal patterns. This methodical attention helped create a careful, layered timeline, essential for understanding what could have happened during those final hours. Investigators also reviewed evidence collected from the area, such as security camera footage, photographs, and reports from residents. Each piece was examined slowly and deliberately, as if turning over a small, intricate object to understand every facet. Nothing was dismissed. Every observation, no matter how subtle, was considered for its potential to provide insight. The investigation was a quiet, deliberate process, emphasizing accuracy and respect above drama or urgency. Meanwhile, tips from the public continued to arrive, some months after Lauren's disappearance. People shared memories, sightings, or information they thought might be relevant. Investigators approached each tip carefully, cross-referencing it against the established timeline and known facts. The process was like gentle sifting through soft sand, slow, deliberate, and intentional, searching for the particles that could provide clarity. Each lead was assessed with care, and while many did not yield immediate results, the ongoing effort reflected the steady commitment to understanding the truth. Family members remained deeply involved in supporting the investigation, providing insight into Lauren's habits, routines, and personality. Their presence helped maintain the narrative of who Lauren was, ensuring that the investigation remained grounded in her life rather than speculation. It also reminded everyone involved that this was a human story, a young woman with friends, hopes, and dreams, and not merely a set of facts to be solved. This understanding shaped the tone of the investigation, guiding it toward careful, respectful analysis. Throughout this time, authorities maintained a calm, methodical approach. There were no dramatic chases or sudden breakthroughs, only persistent, steady work. The investigation continued quietly, a testament to patience and diligence, and a reflection of the importance of methodical care in piecing together what happened during those uncertain hours. As the investigation into Lauren Spirer's disappearance continued over weeks and months, various theories and hypotheses began to take shape. It is important to approach this part of the story gently, with calm reflection, remembering that the purpose is understanding, not fear. Each possibility arose from careful observation, witness statements, and the patterns that emerged from her last known movements. One consideration was the simple possibility of an accidental incident. Investigators explored the areas Lauren was known to frequent, including quiet streets, parking lots, and nearby paths, thinking through how an ordinary evening walk could turn into a situation where she might become lost or disoriented. These reflections were grounded in gentle logic. A person stepping into shadows, unfamiliar terrain, or a poorly lit area could encounter challenges, even in a familiar environment. It is a reminder of how ordinary circumstances can sometimes unexpectedly lead to uncertainty. Another line of thought involved the interactions Lauren had with friends and acquaintances that night. Investigators examined the details of conversations, movements between locations, and the flow of the evening. Each exchange was carefully considered, as even small details can shed light on patterns that may explain subsequent events. Throughout this process, care was taken to focus on observable facts rather than assumptions, maintaining a steady and calm perspective that respected all involved. Investigators also considered the possibility of someone intentionally leading her away, though this was approached quietly and analytically. Every tip, suggestion, or reported sighting was weighed carefully, with attention to context and plausibility. There was no rush to judgment, only a measured evaluation of what could have occurred based on available information. The calm approach allowed the investigators to maintain clarity, avoiding sensational conclusions while still exploring necessary possibilities.